What's up, YouTubers? We're going to be doing a set of brakes today. I'm going to just show you one side and what I do on a Honda, because this is a little, just one step different, I guess, from other vehicles. When taking the caliper off, we have our bolts out of our Honda. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to loosen these two bolts for the caliper, and then there's two more bolts back here that are 17 for the caliper bracket. So the caliper bracket has to be removed for us to remove this rotor. We have everything loose just so we can speed up the process a little bit. So these are the bolts for the caliper. Before we pull our caliper off, what I like to do, just so it comes off a little bit easier, I like to pull on it, compress that piston back into the caliper, and did this bolt too, so we'll have some room to work with on the caliper. And I also have this J-hook deal so we don't put tension on the line. What you could do is you can grab your caliper, wherever's best suited, and then perch it on your upper control arm, your spring, wherever's convenient and less stress on the line itself. So now that we have our caliper off, we're going to want to take our brake pads out. I mean, pretty good set of brake pads, but they were squeaking, so I'm going to swap out for some new ones. Okay, now that we got our pads out, we're going to want to take our caliper bracket off. Top and the bottom, 17 mil. Our caliper bolts for the caliper itself are 12 millimeter. So once we pull these bolts out, take that off of there. And what we want to do before we set this down, so we want to make sure these are called slides. So this is a full floating brake system. What we want to do is we want to make sure that moves nice and freely. It's going to have a little bit of resistance, probably because of the grease in there, but we want it to be able to move. If it doesn't move, you're not going to have full floating brakes, and maybe one side, like one pad, is going to wear faster than the other one because that caliper isn't free to move. So these feel really good. I'm going to leave them. And then with our new brake pads, we ended up getting new new tabs for them to slide on. So we're going to remove those guys. What I also like to do is when I remove those, I like to make sure that there's no extra buildup right here. So we either take one of these or we take a small flathead and clean up these areas so our new caliper sliders will sit in there real nice. I'm going to touch back on the caliper sliders just for a second. So a lot of the times when I see these are seized up, I see a rip in the boot, and that's really all it's going to take to be able to seize this guy right here. If that happens, there's really a couple of ways you can go about it. You can go to the junkyard, get some new sliders out of the same car. They might sell rebuild kits for these, or if you can just find a boot, clean up the old one, and make it slide in there decent with like a high temp grease. Because these are brakes. I mean, if you're coming off the freeway or something, they tend to get pretty hot very quickly. So I run a high temp grease in there. But yeah. Just make sure that these are both sliding relatively easy. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on that one, just so you don't have brake problems down the road. But so we're moving on to our rotor here. And this one, after we took our bolts out, it's still not coming out. So it typically builds up rust right here, and essentially seizes it onto this. If you haven't changed your brakes in a while, this rotor might be stuck on here even after you take out these two bolts, and that's just the buildup of rust, and over time it just likes to seize itself on there. So there's two ways we can go about it. We can take a hammer to it. We try not to do that just because it's gonna put a lot of strain on our wheel bearing. So what we like to do is, most of the rotors that I've seen are going to have these two bolt holes right here. And so you'll probably have a couple of bolts laying on a 12 millimeter head. So what we're going to do is we're going to shove that in there, take an impact to it, So now that we got our rotor off, we want to make sure that this surface is nice and flat, so we're not going to get wheel wobble down. Here we have our new brake rotor. Before we put these on, I like to take some brake clean to both surfaces, because when they pack these, they usually oil it so it doesn't get all rusty sitting on the shelf, and you don't get a rusty caliper. I just take a rag, fold it twice, add some brake clean on there, wipe it off really good. Make sure you don't see any shiny spots, because that's usually the indication that it's oiled. So right here, I don't know if you can tell, but there's oil right there compared to, this is more of a flat appearance, like flat color appearance, I guess. So we do both sides. To get oil onto our pads, they're not going to be as efficient as if they go on dry. So now that we got our nice, clean, dry brake rotor, slap her on. Put our bolts back in. Like I said, this is not a needed step. This is just for factory stuff. So if you don't have bolts to put back in here, I wouldn't worry about it too much, because the torque of the wheel sitting in front of this is going to hold it in place. Just to show you how this works, we're going to tighten it down with this, so you get an idea of how this tool works when loosening and tightening it. So we have it to our spinning right. A couple of these tools might be different on how they label their items or their tools. So what we do is we put it on there, make sure it's planted pretty good. Then what I like to do is I like to put a little tension on it, go in the way that I want it to, then I hit it. See how that tightened up a little bit? So same thing with this one. Now we're in business. After we get a rotor on there, we went through and we cleaned up our caliper bracket mating points for the tabs, the slider tabs. So we're just going to pop those in there. Just like so. So that's a really nice fit since we cleaned up this bracket. Put our other one in there. Oh yeah, nice and tight. Then we're going to put our caliper bracket back on. If I can find the hole. Socket, or a big ratcheting 17 mil socket. I just have a wobble on there. Whatever works best for you. You'll figure it out as you do the first one, and then the second one should be a little bit faster. Be sure to get these nice and tight. If they ever get loose on you, you're gonna have some major brake problems. Okay. And with the tab, like most brake pads are gonna have tabs. This is a tab right here. This is basically letting you know, hey, I'm getting low. I need to be changed out. And it's gonna start squeaking on the rotor. So when I like to put these in, I like to have this guy facing the opposite direction of the rotor, the direction the rotor is going to go most of the time. So when we're going, this is going to be on the back right here, and when it's going like this, it's actually going to push this guy up against this this pad material, not this pad material. It's going to push up against this metal plate that the brake material is sitting on. But if you have it, let's say this way, it's actually going to pull away, and it might not let you know, hey, I need to be swapped out. So I like it going the direction it's going to be heading most of the time. So let's say you have a brake caliper set up back here. I'm going to set it up like that in the back, because the brake rotor is going to be spinning this way the majority of the time, and it's going to plant itself on this bracket right here. Before we put these on, I like to grease these tabs so they slide really easy. Try not to get this material on the pad itself. If you do, you'll have some inefficient brake pads. A little on the back for the piston. Put her on. Bada bing, bada boom. Other pad. Grease set up nice and moderately, I guess. A little bit on the back. Slap her in. Bada bing, bada boom. Another tool we're going to use is if you have brakes that are absolutely worn, this piston is just out super far, you're going to want to get something like this. You can also use other tools, but I like this tool specifically just because it's specifically for calipers. And what you do is you just put it in right there, and then you squeeze the handle, and it's going to compress this piston back into its cylinder. If there's too much of a space right here, you can always use a used brake pad, put it right here, and then put this guy on there just for bigger brake jobs. So we're gonna go put this bad boy back on. Put our bolts back in. Took this guy off too, so we're going to want to put that one back in. Tighten her up. Put a decent amount of load on here, but not enough to break it. I mean, I know that's pretty unspecific, but so this is a 12 millimeter, and I wouldn't do it super tight, but tight enough to where you know it's not going to fall off. You'll get a feel for it, like the more you work on stuff. The bigger the bolt, the more strain it can take. If you need to, for torque specs, you can look up, you know, pretty much anything on Google. You can look up torque spec for these, whatever other bolts you're working on, torque specs for these even. And that is how you change rotors and pads. Make sure to like and subscribe.